Granddaughter found the clock first. She'd been helping me carry the Christmas boxes up from the basement, the ones Margaret and I had packed together 15 years ago before her knees gave out. Emma's 9 now, sharp as a tack, curious about everything, the kind of kid who notices things adults stop seeing. She lifted the antique mantel clock out of its wrapping tissue and held it up. "Grandpa, why does this one have a little hole that the other clocks don't have?" I took it from her, turned it over in my hands. At first I thought it was a flaw in the brass casing, a crack maybe, or a manufacturing defect from whenever the thing was made. I brought it closer to the lamp. It wasn't a flaw. I set the clock down slowly on the coffee table, kept my face still. Decades of running a machine shop teaches you to stay calm when something's about to go wrong. "Go help Grandma with the cookies, sweetheart." She skipped off to the kitchen. I stood there alone with that clock and felt the floor shift underneath me. 3 days later, my daughter-in-law was answering questions from a detective. 5 weeks after that, she wasn't living in her house anymore. But it started with the clock. Let me tell you everything. My name is Robert, and I'm 71 years old. I spent 42 years running Holt Precision Manufacturing in Dayton, Ohio. Small parts, aerospace contracts, nothing glamorous but honest work that I built from 3 employees and a borrowed lathe into something that kept 60 families fed. I sold the business in 2019. My retirement savings sit at just over $430,000. My house in Oakwood, the one Margaret and I bought in 1987, is worth about $310,000 on today's market. I tell you those numbers because they matter to this story. They're why this happened. Margaret had her first stroke in March of 2022, her second one that October. She can walk, she can talk, she can laugh at her programs and beat me at gin rummy on a good night. But she needs help. She gets tired quickly. She can't drive. On harder days, she struggles to remember the right word for things. We have a home health aide 3 mornings a week, a woman named Lucille who Margaret adores and who makes better biscuits than I do, which Margaret takes great pleasure in reminding me of. Our son Doug is 44. He lives 20 minutes away in Centerville with his wife Brenda and their daughter Emma. Doug works in commercial insurance. He's a decent man who loves his daughter and coaches her soccer team on Saturdays. He is also, when it comes to his wife, about as perceptive as a brick. Brenda is 41. She's attractive, well-organized, and has a way of moving through a room like she's already decided she owns it. I've never been able to put my finger on exactly what bothers me about her. Margaret figured it out years ago. She's performing, she told me once. Every single thing she does is a performance for an audience she's always imagining. I thought Margaret was being uncharitable. I was wrong about that too. We kept Christmas at our house every year. Always had. Margaret's tree, the one she decorates with ornaments, collected over 50 years. The cranberry garland she strings herself even when her hands shake. It mattered to her more than I can explain. Emma would sleep over Christmas Eve, wake up shrieking at 5 in the morning, drag us both out of bed to see what was under the tree. It was good. It was ours. This past Christmas, 3 days before the holiday, a package arrived by delivery truck. Addressed to Margaret and me. The card was in Brenda's handwriting, with love from Doug, Brenda, and Emma, a little something to brighten the house. Inside the box, nestled in black foam padding, was a beautiful antique mantel clock, brass case, Roman numerals, the kind of piece that would have sat in a Victorian parlor. Elegant, thoughtful even. I put it on the fireplace mantel. Margaret said it was lovely. 2 days later, Emma noticed the hole. I carried the clock to my workshop in the basement. Set it under the bright fluorescent light I use for detail work. Got my magnifying visor, the one I'd worn for 20 years examining precision parts. Examined that hole. Camera lens. Tiny, maybe 3 millimeters across, recessed behind the brass scrollwork, so you'd never see it unless you were looking. A wireless transmitter. I unscrewed the base plate. There was a battery pack, small but capable, and a SIM card slot. Active. Transmitting. I set down my screwdriver and sat on my workbench stool for a long time. This wasn't a gift. This was a listening post. In my living room, pointed at the couch where Margaret and I spent every evening, where we talked about her medical appointments, our finances, her medications, whether we'd talked to the estate attorney lately, where we were vulnerable, every night, and didn't know anyone was watching. I thought about the last 4 months, the questions Brenda had started asking at family dinners. Casual, friendly, always slipping in sideways. "How's Margaret's memory been, Dad?" Doug mentioned she sometimes has trouble with names. Or, "You must find the house overwhelming sometimes, Robert. All that upkeep at your age." She'd started calling me Robert instead of Dad sometime around September. I'd noticed but hadn't said anything. I thought about the phone call I'd overheard in October, when Brenda had stepped onto our back patio during Thanksgiving prep, and I'd come around the corner of the house with an armload of firewood. Her voice had been low, quick, professional. The timeline depends on the evaluation. Once we have that, the rest moves pretty fast. I thought she was talking about a work project. I am apparently a very trusting man. I went upstairs. Margaret was asleep in her chair, the television low. I stood in the doorway watching her breathe, that particular kind of fear moving through me that doesn't make noise, just settles cold in the center of your chest and stays. I didn't wake her. I went to my office, opened my laptop, and started looking up elder law attorneys in Dayton. One name appeared in 3 different searches: Patricia Keene, specialized in elder abuse, guardianship fraud, financial exploitation. 14 years in practice. I called her office at 8 the next morning, Christmas Eve, and got her personal voicemail. Left a message that I suspect sounded very controlled for a man whose hands were shaking. She called back within the hour. When I told her about the clock, she was quiet for a moment. "Mr. Holt," she said, "don't touch anything else in that house until we speak in person. Can you come in today?" Her office was in a low brick building off Far Hills Avenue, the kind of place that doesn't announce itself. Patricia Keene was in her early 50s, hair pulled back, reading glasses on a chain around her neck. The manner of someone who has spent a long time listening to stories that make her angry and has learned to channel that into precision. I showed her photos of the clock's interior. She looked at them without expression. She asked me to walk her through the last 6 months. I talked for 40 minutes. The questions at dinner. The phone call. The subtle suggestions that Margaret's condition was worsening faster than it actually was. The way Brenda had started copying herself on emails I sent to our accountant. Doug had mentioned it once as a casual aside. Brenda just likes to keep organized, and I hadn't thought to question it. When I finished, Patricia set down her pen. "Mr. Tupper, Holt, I want to look up something before I say anything further." She turned to her computer, typed, clicked. Was quiet for a moment that lasted approximately 1,000 years. "There's a guardianship petition filed with the Montgomery County Probate Court, filed 11 days ago. Your name and your wife's name are both listed." The room contracted. 11 days ago. The petition argues cognitive decline, inability to manage finances, and concerns about your wife's medical care. The petitioner is listed as your daughter-in-law. Not Doug. Brenda. "Attorney of record is a man named Stephen Vance," Patricia continued. "Have you had any contact with him?" I hadn't heard the name. She pulled up his profile, 47 years old, corporate background, shifted to estate and probate law. 8 years ago. She clicked through a few more pages and got quieter in a way that I recognized as meaningful. "He's filed 4 similar petitions in the last 2 years, all involving elderly individuals with substantial assets. All 4 resulted in guardianship being transferred. 3 of those estates were fully liquidated within 90 days of placement." "Placement where?" "Memory care facilities. 1 in Springfield, 2 in Cincinnati." She paused. 2 of the 4 individuals are deceased." She said it the way you'd say it in a doctor's office. Matter of fact, because that's the only way to say things that terrible. I sat with it for a moment. "What happens if they get guardianship?" Patricia folded her hands on her desk. "They would have legal control over all financial decisions. Your home, your retirement accounts, your investments. They could authorize Margaret's placement in a care facility, and yours as well, if they argue you can't provide adequate care for her. Once you're placed and declared incompetent, you have no legal standing to reverse it. The assets would be managed and liquidated by the guardian, by Brenda, and potentially by Vance, depending on how the guardianship is structured." I thought about the clock, about the SIM card, about who was on the other end of that transmission. "I need to ask you something," I said. Is it possible Vance and my daughter-in-law have a personal relationship beyond attorney and client? Patricia's expression didn't shift. What makes you ask? Brenda travels for work. Pharmaceutical sales. She's away 3 or 4 nights a month. Doug mentioned once that she's had the same regional account manager for years, that they work closely together. He said it casually. He thought it was boring. I paused. Her account manager's name is Steve. Patricia wrote something down. I'll look into it. She outlined what we needed to do. File a police report about the surveillance device. Document every conversation I could recall. Get character witnesses who could speak to my competency and Margaret's actual condition versus what the petition claimed. And, she said this carefully, we needed to talk to Doug. I drove home in the gray December afternoon and sat in the driveway for a few minutes before going inside. Christmas Day was the hardest performance of my life. Doug and Brenda arrived at 11 with Emma, who detonated through the front door in the way that 9-year-olds do, all shrieking and wrapping paper and forgetting to take her boots off. Margaret laughed and held her. I watched Brenda move through our kitchen, helping herself to coffee, complimenting the tree, asking Margaret how her therapy had been going. Warm, attentive, perfectly pitched. I smiled and passed the rolls and said nothing. After dinner, while Margaret and Emma were in the living room with a puzzle, I asked Doug to come help me with something in the garage. He followed me out. I closed the door behind us. I showed him the photos on my phone. The camera. The transmitter. The SIM card. He stared at the screen for a long time. Dad, I need you to listen before you say anything. I kept my voice even. There is a guardianship petition filed against your mother and me. It was filed by your wife 11 days ago. The attorney she hired has placed 4 elderly people in facilities and liquidated their estates. 2 of them are dead. Doug sat down on the workbench. Actually sat down, like his legs went out. I didn't. She told me she was just looking into options. In case something happened. She said you'd never go along with planning, that someone needed to be prepared. She put a camera in our living room, Doug. He put his face in his hands. We sat in the cold garage for a long time. When he finally looked up, his eyes were red, and he looked younger than I'd seen him look since he was about 30. I found emails, he said quietly. 2 months ago, between her and Vance. I told myself they were professional. I wanted to believe that. His voice cracked. We've been having problems for a long time. I didn't want to see it. I know. She said, if I ever... He stopped. Started again. She said, if I made things difficult, she'd get sole custody of Emma. That she had documentation of things I'd said and done that would look bad in court. I didn't think she'd actually... He looked at me. Dad, I am so sorry. I didn't know about the clock. I didn't know about Mom being on the petition. I believe you. What do I do? You talk to Patricia Keene. Tomorrow morning. You bring everything you have. The emails. Anything else. And then you make a choice about what kind of man you are. He nodded slowly. His hands were steady by the time we went back inside. We didn't say anything to Brenda that evening. I watched her say goodbye to Margaret, hug Emma, load up the car. She paused at the front door and looked at me. It was a lovely Christmas, Robert. It was, I said. She smiled and left. The escalation came faster than Patricia had predicted. 4 days after Christmas, Brenda called to tell me she was coming to take Emma for a few days. A post-holiday trip she'd arranged, she said, a little surprise for Emma before school started. They'd be at her parents' place in Columbus. She gave me a different address. Something in my chest went cold and flat and certain. I'd gone to a Verizon store the day before and bought Emma a small GPS-enabled smartwatch, pink, waterproof, marketed as a kid's safety device. I'd given it to her the day after Christmas, told her it was a special gift from Grandpa so I could always make sure she was safe. She'd been delighted. Her mother had smiled at me over Emma's head. When Brenda pulled into my driveway and Emma hugged me goodbye, I whispered in her ear, if you ever feel scared or you need me, press the little red button on your watch, sweetheart. It calls Grandpa no matter what. She squeezed me tight. I watched the car go. I pulled up the address she'd given me, gas station on the eastern edge of Columbus that had been closed for 2 years. I sat at my kitchen table and watched the watch's GPS signal on my laptop. Margaret came in, and I told her I was doing paperwork. She brought me coffee and touched my shoulder and didn't ask questions. She has always known when not to ask questions. Emma's signal moved steadily northeast toward Columbus, then turned onto a residential street in Worthington. Not the address I'd been given. At 3:47 in the afternoon, the red button activated. I was already on the phone with 911 before the second GPS ping came through. My granddaughter activated an emergency alert. I was given a false address. She's at? I read out the Worthington location. I told the dispatcher there was an active guardianship fraud case, that the child's father and my attorney could both be reached immediately. The dispatcher's tone shifted when I said attorney. It always does. I was 3 hours away, but Doug was 45 minutes from Worthington. Patricia had prepped him for exactly this. He was moving before I finished calling him. 2 patrol officers reached the house first. Then Doug. He called me from the driveway. "She's okay, Dad. She's okay. She's been crying." I closed my eyes. Emma had pressed the button, Doug told me later, because Brenda and her parents, and Vance, who had been at the house, which told us everything we needed to know, had spent 2 hours asking her questions. Careful questions, framed as games, as practice. What would you say if someone asked whether Grandpa forgets things? What would you tell a doctor about Grandma's bad days? Emma was 9 years old, and she knew she was being asked to lie. She'd held out for 2 hours. Then she'd pressed the button. My granddaughter held out for 2 hours. The officer who took Emma aside, a woman named Cooper, patient, good with kids, wrote in her report that Emma had described feeling trapped and had said the adults kept telling her that lying would help Grandpa. Emma had said, "I knew it wouldn't help him. It would hurt him." 9 years old. The emergency hearing before Judge Warren in Montgomery County Probate Court was scheduled for the 3rd week of January. Patricia had moved fast. So had the district attorney's office once they reviewed the surveillance equipment and the GPS logs and the audio. Because yes, the smartwatch had been recording ambient sound, a feature I had not known about and which I now consider the single best accident of my life. The audio captured an hour and 40 minutes at the Worthington house. Brenda's voice, clinical and pressuring. Her mother's voice, gentler but pursuing the same lines. And Vance, who was supposed to be an attorney acting as a neutral legal professional, coaching the 9-year-old child on what to tell a social worker. Patricia played me the recording the morning before the hearing. I sat in her office and listened without moving. At one point Emma said very quietly, "But Grandpa makes my breakfast every time I stay over. He always remembers." Brenda said, "Sophie, that's not what matters right now." She'd used the wrong name. Emma's name is Emma. She'd been so focused on the script, she'd used the wrong child's name. Emma had not answered after that. She'd pressed the button 12 minutes later. The courtroom was wood-paneled, fluorescent lit, the particular institutional beige of places where consequential things happen without drama. Judge Warren was 63 years old, 26 years on the bench, the kind of judge who makes you feel that she has already decided you aren't going to waste her time. Vance stood for his opening statement and delivered exactly the performance Patricia had predicted. A devoted family, a concerned daughter-in-law, a deteriorating situation, the loving choice of appropriate care. He was polished. He'd done this before. Brenda took the stand and cried. Controlled tears, carefully deployed. Robert forgets appointments. Robert left the stove on twice. Margaret's condition is worsening and Robert is in denial. She gripped the stand with both hands and looked at the judge like she was asking for help. Her parents testified. Friends of Brenda's who had met me a handful of times testified to concerns about my sharpness. Then Patricia stood up. Exhibit 1, the clock. The technical expert she'd retained, a forensic specialist from Columbus, testified for 11 minutes about the camera's specifications, its wireless transmission capability, and the IP address it had been transmitting to, which resolved to a server registered to Vance's law office. The courtroom did not erupt because courtrooms don't. But I felt the temperature change. Exhibit 2, The GPS logs from Emma's watch, showing the route taken on the day Brenda had given me a false address, documenting exactly where Emma had been and when the emergency alert had activated. Exhibit 3. The audio. Judge Warren listened to the full recording without expression. 12 people in that courtroom listened to a 9-year-old girl say, "But Grandpa makes my breakfast every time," and then go silent. 12 people heard Vance's voice in the background, coaching. Vance attempted 3 objections. The judge sustained none of them. My doctor took the stand and testified about my actual cognitive function, excellent for my age, no indicators of decline, managing my wife's complex medical care with full competence. He had records going back 6 years. Margaret's neurologist testified about the actual trajectory of her condition, managed, stable, appropriately treated, not deteriorating at the rate the petition claimed. My accountant, a man I've worked with for 19 years, brought a full record of how I'd managed our finances. Every investment, every decision, every filing, done correctly and on schedule. And then Doug walked to the witness stand. He sat down and looked at Brenda across the courtroom. She looked back. Something passed between them that I couldn't read. He testified for 35 minutes. The emails, the hotel receipts. A phone call he'd recorded in November, when Brenda had said, "And I will remember this word for word. Once the old man signs over, Vance handles the rest, and we're done." He'd recorded it on his phone, in his car, sitting outside a Kroger parking lot, because he'd known and been afraid and hadn't known what else to do. He said, "Toward the end, I knew what was happening and I didn't stop it. I was scared and I told myself I was protecting my daughter. I wasn't. I was protecting myself. My father deserved better. My daughter deserved better. That's all I have to say." Judge Warren was quiet for a moment after he stepped down. She ruled from the bench. Petition for guardianship. Denied. Robert and Margaret Holt are competent, independent, and in no need of court-appointed oversight. The petition is found to have been filed in bad faith, in furtherance of a scheme to exploit vulnerable adults for financial gain. Referral to the Montgomery County District Attorney, elder abuse, conspiracy to commit fraud, illegal surveillance, child endangerment. All 4 named parties, Brenda, her parents, and Vance, Stephen Vance, referred to the Ohio State Bar for investigation of professional conduct violations, criminal conspiracy, and abuse of the legal process. Restraining order against Brenda, against her parents, no contact with Robert, Margaret, or Emma Crawford. Emergency custody of Emma, granted to Doug, primary. Brenda's parental rights, suspended pending criminal proceedings. Supervised visitation to be determined after psychological evaluation. Judge Warren looked out at the courtroom before she closed. Elder abuse dressed in the language of concern is still elder abuse. Using a child to perpetrate it is an offense this court treats with the full gravity it deserves. She gathered her papers and left. I want to tell you what the months after looked like, because I think it matters. Vance surrendered his law license in February. While facing 5 criminal charges, the DA's investigation opened 2 of the other cases he'd handled. Families are now reviewing what happened to their relatives. 3 of Brenda's other case files came under review at her pharmaceutical company, unrelated but not entirely unconnected. When you look at one thing carefully, sometimes other things come into focus. Brenda's criminal case is ongoing. She's out on bail and living with her parents, who have their own proceedings to contend with. Doug filed for divorce in January. He and Emma are living in the house in Centerville. Emma has a therapist she likes, a woman who specializes in kids who've been through family trauma, and Doug says she's been making pictures in her sessions, bright, specific pictures of things she loves. Many of them are of our kitchen. The breakfast table, the cookie jar Margaret keeps on the counter. Margaret knows most of what happened. I told her in stages, careful about which parts to tell when. She listened without interrupting, which is not her natural inclination. She's a woman who has opinions and has never been shy about them. When I finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "I always thought something was off about that woman." I laughed. The first real laugh I'd had in 2 months. She reached over and took my hand. "You protected us, Robert." "We protected us," I said. "Emma did half the work. she smiled. She gets it from my side. I think about what would have happened if Emma hadn't noticed that hole. I might have noticed eventually. The clock was right there on the mantel. I walked past it a dozen times a day. Or I might never have noticed. I'm a machinist, not an electronics man, and that lens was well hidden. And if I hadn't noticed, within weeks there would have been an evaluation. A social worker's visit, carefully arranged. Questions asked of Margaret on a hard day. Documents signed by a Dr. Brenda had already identified. A facility selected. And I would have been on the other side of it. Confused, angry, legally powerless, while everything Margaret and I built together was unwound by someone who had sat at our Christmas table and accepted our hospitality and called it love. That's what this kind of theft looks like. It doesn't show up with a gun. It shows up with a concerned expression and a gift-wrapped clock and a voice full of nothing but care for your well-being. If you're watching this and something in your gut has been trying to tell you something about someone in your life, a family member who asks too many questions about your finances, who exaggerates your limitations to others, who positions themselves as your caretaker before you've asked for one, I want to say this directly. Trust that feeling. Document what you're seeing. Find an elder law attorney in your area before you need one urgently. And if you have grandchildren, tell them that pressing a button to call for help is never the wrong choice. Emma knew that. She held out for 2 hours, and then she chose her grandfather over the pressure in that room. I don't have words adequate to what that means to me, so I'll just say she's coming for spring break next month. She's already requested strawberry pancakes for the first morning, and I have every ingredient ready, and I will not forget a single one. I've thought a lot about the moment Emma noticed that hole in the clock. A 9-year-old girl carrying a dusty Christmas box up from the basement, not looking for anything wrong, just curious, the way kids are curious. She didn't know what a camera lens was. She just knew that something didn't look right, and she said so out loud. That's what saved us. Not my 42 years of running a business. Not my experience with contracts and people and knowing when something's off. Emma, because she hadn't yet learned the adult habit of talking yourself out of what you're seeing. I think about that a lot. We spend so much of our lives learning to second-guess our instincts. We tell ourselves we're being paranoid. We tell ourselves we're being uncharitable. We tell ourselves that someone who sits at our table and hugs our grandchildren couldn't possibly mean us harm. Because if they could, what does that say about how badly we misjudged them? And so we look away. We explain things away. We protect ourselves from the uncomfortable truth by refusing to look at it directly. I did that for months. I noticed the questions about our finances. I noticed the way Brenda positioned herself between Margaret and the decisions about Margaret's care. I noticed that my son had gone quiet and evasive in a way that didn't fit who he was. I noticed all of it, and I kept finding reasons why it probably meant nothing. What changed everything wasn't courage. I want to be honest about that. It was a 9-year-old asking a simple question I couldn't answer, but what I did after that, the documenting, the attorney, the decision to be methodical instead of reactive, that was a choice, every step of it. And the lesson I keep coming back to isn't some grand statement about justice or family or standing your ground. It's simpler and harder than that. The people who tried to do this to Margaret and me were counting on a very specific thing, that I would be too trusting to notice, too proud to ask for help, and too isolated by the time I figured it out to do anything about it. That's the whole architecture of this kind of exploitation. It depends entirely on the person being targeted staying quiet, staying confused, staying alone. Doug stayed quiet for 6 months because he was afraid. I understand that. Fear is a real thing, and Brenda knew exactly which fear to use on him, but the silence cost him, cost all of us, months we could have spent differently. What finally moved him wasn't anything I said to him in the garage. It was hearing Emma's voice on that recording. It was the specific, undeniable reality of what his silence had allowed to happen to his daughter. That's what broke it open. Cause and effect is not always poetic. Sometimes it's just relentless. Every choice Brenda and Vance made created a consequence they hadn't fully thought through. The camera in the clock created the hole Emma noticed. The GPS watch I bought created the audio record they never knew existed. The false address they sent me created a paper trail that the DA used in the indictment. They were careful, and they were still undone by the accumulation of their own decisions. And I was nearly undone by mine, by the months I spent being a reasonable man in an unreasonable situation. If I had one thing to say to anyone watching this who recognizes something in this story, not the legal details, but the feeling, that low-level unease that you keep explaining away, it's this: the instinct that something is wrong is not the same as paranoia. One comes from evidence your brain is processing before your conscious mind catches up. The other comes from fear without cause. Learning to tell the difference is hard, but it is a skill, and it is worth developing, and it starts with deciding that your own observations deserve to be taken seriously. Emma took hers seriously. She didn't have any framework for what she was seeing. She just said it out loud. That was enough.